A democracy that's strong, fair, and true depends on you. Introducing onAir, a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital democracy network. It's a hub that connects citizens with their government and with the candidates, the issues, and each other.
Good evening. I'm Connor Oatman, and I will be your host for this evening's US onAir Aircast. Our sponsor tonight is Democracy onAir, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the US onAir network of 50 governance and election hubs at us.onair.cc. Our Aircast today will be a review of the top news topics for today, Friday, April 1st, 2022. To begin, the House passes a $35 a month insulin cap as Dems seek a wider bill. The House has passed a bill capping the monthly cost of insulin at $35 for insured patients, part of an election year push by Democrats for price curbs on prescription drugs at a time of rising inflation. The Affordable Insulin Now Act will serve as a political vehicle to rally Democrats and force Republicans who oppose it into uncomfortable votes ahead of the midterms. For the legislation to pass Congress, 10 Republican senators would have to vote in favor. Democrats acknowledge they don't have an answer for how this is going to happen. Moving on, our next story today relates to the January 6th uprising, and an official review of Trump phone logs from January 6th finds that the record is complete. In the 7 hours during which White House records show no phone calls to or from then-President Donald Trump on January 6, 2021, among the calls that are conspicuously absent is one Trump made to then-Vice President Mike Pence that morning from the Oval Office. While the call is not specifically noted in the presidential diary or the presidential call log, its existence has been corroborated by multiple sources who were with Trump and Pence that day, including former aides who testified before the House Select Committee investigating the U.S. Capitol attack. Moving on, we now have a video to present today regarding the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and how the development of this war and tough sanctions against Russia could permanently change and reshape the global economy.
As we've heard, oil prices have largely climbed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is one key part of the larger economic fallout from the war and from the tough sanctions that the U.S. and many other countries have imposed on Russia in response. Our economics correspondent Paul Sullivan looks at the global impact of these moves.
Columbia University's Adam Tooze has chronicled the biggest economic events in recent history, from Nazism to COVID, World War I to the crash of '08. So what does the crisis in Ukraine mean for the global economy?
What we're worrying about is energy, oil and gas, and the other thing we're worrying about is food.
Worrying about soaring prices, since Russia is a key supplier of oil and gas to much of the world. And together, Russia and Ukraine export so much of the world's wheat.
The shock of the war, the prospect of uncertainty in markets which, as far as energy were concerned, were already very tight. And in the Black Sea, through which the grain has to travel, the actual fact of a shooting war and ships being sunk has led to an interruption in supply, and then speculators get hold of the story and the market rises, if you like, anticipating future shortage. And it's those two effects which are really going to be decisive, not just for the rich countries of the world, but in a sense even more significant for low-income countries.
Our next segment will include a discussion with our featured guest. But first, for the GMU community, Democracy onAir is sponsoring a Speak Up for Impact contest that promotes university competitions to have the most impact on local, state, and federal government and elections via informed civil discussion among university communities and their elected officials. You can check out the us.onair.cc hub for more information. Here is one of the submissions.
Hello, Senator Menendez, Senator Booker, and Representative Malinowski. I would like to present a way to improve voting rights in the United States. The United States is often referred to as one of the strongest democracies, but as of late, there have been glaring cracks in the system that many have seen, culminating in the horrendous events of January 6, 2021, which threatened our very democratic institutions. From this, there are steps the United States government should take to strengthen them. One idea are stronger election and voting laws, which protect voters and their rights on election day. I think in many state legislators, including New Jersey's, election day should be considered a federal holiday, and there should be more polling stations for those who are more likely to vote. These laws would need, and there are also election laws that would need to be repealed, such as having polling stations in districts that skew against them.
Joining us this evening is our featured guest, Paul Sullivan, here to give a bit more insight into the ongoing economic situation with regards to Russian sanctions. Thank you for being with us here this evening, Paul.
Of course.
So to begin, I wanted to ask you what you see as the most pressing situation regarding economic changes due to sanctions against Russia.
I think the biggest focus, well, I think at least in the short term, we need to focus on today, as in what is gas prices that are in the $4, $5, and even some parts of the country, $6 range mean for the broader economy? What does that mean for truck drivers? What does that mean for food prices? And perhaps, I think, and more importantly, I think we should also consider what happens tomorrow and next month, right? If this conflict drags on, it's not, the US is actually in a relatively safe position in terms of how this war affects them. And as Tu said in his broadcast earlier, we have to think about poorer countries too, right? It might be $6 even in the United States. What does that mean for a place like India? What does that mean for Pakistan, right? Gas prices might be way higher there, and it will affect their economy much more drastically than here.
Moving on from like just gas prices, the video that we covered today mentioned Ukraine and Russia as major wheat and grain exporters for the majority of the world. How do you think this economic backlash and this decrease in production of a very important staple crop that is exported all around the world will affect even more well-off countries that aren't necessarily as agriculturally viable, like South Korea or certain EU member nations that are too mountainous to grow the majority of their own crops and have to import?
I think that it wouldn't be that far or that unreasonable to say that if current trends and the current conflict drags on, we could see something of a very, very light recession, right? So having food prices that go from, like, say, $2, $3 for a loaf of bread to, like, say, $5 or $6, that's a near doubling, right? And that impact scales up at every level of the economic ladder, right? That means families will have to choose, well-off families have to choose something of less nutritional value and have less availability. And for poor families, that means they get nothing. That means they have to choose between, do I pay for rent or do I pay for food? And that will have massive ripple effects throughout even wealthy countries.
Do you see this in the long term as a major obstacle following the end of the war to the rebuilding of Ukraine and Russia's economies respectively? Do you think that they'll have the ability to even return their economies to the point where they were prior to this conflict?
I think the capacity is there in the very, very long term, but I think one of the short-term impacts of this is, as the video mentioned, is sort of the disjunction between sort of globalization generally, right? When we see is that some sort of fragmentation of globalization, China and Russia on one end, and the so-called West on the other end. And obviously, the point of globalization that we have now is kind of a Pandora's box, right? We can't really go backwards from that to the Cold War. But what we have now is more evidence that there is starting to be a sort of split in globalization. And I think that is massive to take note of.
All right, and we do have some questions coming in from our live stream audience, so I would like to take a few of those. So one question comes in for you is, do you think that home prices will continue to rise as a result of this economic shift?
In terms of home prices, I definitely see that certainly they could go up. It's one of those things that's very drawn out in the economic chain in terms of Ukraine conflict, but I could see it certainly, right? Higher general prices in the economy, say for food, for gas, could mean for, say, a home realtor, right, that their cost of living goes up, right? And that means that they will have to charge more for, say, housing, right? Or for their commission, right? Which drives up housing prices. And yes, this all affects, I think, almost every single part of the economy.
Thank you. We would like to take this opportunity to ask any of our viewers for any last questions before we close out the show for this evening. And it does not look like we have any coming in at the moment. So thank you once again, Paul, for being here with us tonight and giving us your amazing insight into the ongoing situation.
And thank you for having me here.
And that all, folks, is it for this evening's Aircast. Thank you to our participants and our featured guests for your comments. And thank you so much to our live stream audience for watching. You can go to us.onair.cc to learn more about today's news, to read articles and commentary and view videos and live streams, and to comment on this Aircast. Thank you all and have a great evening.